Good afternoon. Today we're going to talk about the elusive but beautiful Elizabeth Courtright Monroe, the wife of President James Monroe. And we'll have a good time looking at her and how different her tenure was as First Lady of the United States. But before we do that, I wanted to add something sort of by way of like a postscript to our discussion of the wonderful Dolly Madison. And I should have mentioned this before. I've talked about it in classes before, and it occurred to me after I had uploaded the video. But Dolly, eh, when you think of Dolly, you think of social gatherings and even after the war when they had to live in the small townhouse that was situated right on a DC sidewalk where she had squeezes. That's what she called one of her squeezes, where everybody would squeeze in to visit. But she loved to have balls and dances. However, because she had been raised as a Quaker, she never herself learned to dance. So she really was creating scenarios for people to enjoy an activity that she herself would not be able to participate in. I don't know why, and I should be able to find that out, but I don't know why she never learned to dance, if it was something that she withheld from herself because of that foundation of beliefs, or other, maybe she just didn't feel gifted or whatever, but she never participated in a dance, although she hosted them and she uh, offered them as times of entertainment and during her time in DC whenever possible. So I just think that was a particularly selfless thing for her to do. There's just no end to trying to understand and unravel all of the personality uh, facets of Mrs. Madison. But let's go on to someone I think is also kind of um, there's more to be learned about Mrs. Monroe, and we're going to look at her in a couple of different ways. We're going to look at her as Washington looked at her, and then we're going to try to understand why they may have had that view and why perhaps their view was incorrect. Elizabeth Monroe was someone who was very well educated, and she was from a very wealthy family in New York. Now, President Monroe was one of the what I call the Virginia mob, like Washington and Jefferson. He is a Virginian, and so there's a unique cultural difference there. I believe that her father had lost some of his fortunes owing to difficulties in the war, but she still came from a very respected and what we would call maybe American pseudo aristocracy. And she had the best of education, and she will make sure that her daughters do as well. I have nothing. I have nothing about their marriage that makes me think that there were difficulties beyond her health measures, and we're going to talk about that in just a few minutes. They seem to be genuinely very much in love with one another, and she will travel with him when he goes abroad as a diplomat to France for George Washington. She will go there and she will save the day for one particular family. If you remember, let me talk about this for a little bit. I think it's a wonderful story set in a very tragic circumstance. Again, James Monroe is in France during probably one of the most difficult stages of their revolution, in the mid 1990s, when the revolution had gone from basically a Republican affair, much like our own, to one that was, I think, lost in violence and bloodlust and ideas that had very little merit. And it cost France a great deal in terms of not only loss of life, but loss of reputation, loss of standing within the continent. So Ambassador Monroe and his wife are over there at this time. I don't think they would have been a target at this point, and you'll see my rationale here. France does not want to alienate the United States. It's very important during this time to stay on good footing with us, lest we join forces with England against them. So, and that's for another class to discuss. But during the era that the Monroes were there in France, in this diplomatic position, there was a terrible aspect of the revolution called the Reign of Terror, or just the Terror. And they had taken it upon themselves to rid France of anyone that could be a threat to the revolution. Well, I believe that this was an excuse just to kill, and the bloodlust took over their judgment. Not that there was any good judgment in this kind of assassination anyway, but they killed so many that they congratulate themselves when they learn how to use a newly developed guillotine to make, I guess, executions just that much more quick and efficient. Like I say, that's another discussion for another course. But in this environment, the Monroes learn that the wife of our beloved Marquis de Lafayette, the son that Washington never had, the little Frenchman who came to the colonies to help us in our noble cause of revolution, he had returned to France, and his wife had found herself in a very perilous situation. Her mother, her sister, and I believe her grandmother, they are all going to be executed for really no other reason than belonging to an aristocratic family. And when the Monroes go to the Bastille, which was their fortress in the center of Paris, I can't tell you this exactly in the center of Paris, but it's in the center of Paris life. The Bastille is being used for some of these notable prisoners awaiting execution. Elizabeth she goes with her husband, and she requests to see the wife of the Marquis. And I'm not sure that she was actually able to see her that day, and she made arrangements to come back later. But through her beauty, her poise, her appearance of fearlessness, and her stunning command of the French language, she so impressed the executioners that the Marquis's wife was spared and lives on for another, I'd say, 10 or 11 years or so. And Elizabeth, Mrs. Monroe, came to be known as La Belle Americaine, the beautiful American. And with her polished manners and just her stunning personality, she saved a life. And a life that, because it was so dear to the Marquis, was ever so dear to the American people as well. So I don't want you to think of Mrs. Monroe as one-dimensional. She had many sides. I believe she was a brave woman, and she has her own difficulties to face, and we'll talk about those in just a second. When President Monroe is elected to his first of 2 terms in 1816, America was about to embark upon what was known as the era of good feelings. And this is when we have essentially become a one-party nation. Can you imagine that? That boggles our mind. A one-party nation. And Monroe, I see Monroe as a good president. He was a little fusspot occasionally. He'd get a little angry about things. He was one of the few that would actually, not say that everything George Washington did was perfect, but I think he was quite a good president. And America enjoyed a period of stability, at least during this first term. Federalists had done themselves in by seeming to take the side of England during the War of 1812 and not to be sympathetic towards the American interpretation of events. And there's even some murmurings about New England, where Federalists were the strongest, seceding. It's just a difficult time in American history. Well, all of that seems to have fallen by the wayside, and like in some of our later 20th century post-war eras, notably World War II, and maybe even the first Gulf War, were very united and very patriotic, inward-looking, grateful to be a nation, and I believe that President Monroe was a good president for that particular period of time in history. Now, Elizabeth, let's talk about her as a first lady. And I want you to listen carefully to what I have to tell you, and then let's look at it in a different lens. She was frequently absent from official state functions. In fact, the first inaugural ball that was held during his presidency, she left before really supper had been served or the majority of the festivities had taken place. She just left. She very often didn't attend those formal events, even in her own homes. In her own home, she allowed her two daughters, Eliza and Maria, to substitute as hostess for her. And I do want to say about the girls, they did have a tendency towards being snobs. So, well, that's a little, I think we could say that's probably a fair. They actually had gone to school in France with Napoleon's stepdaughter, had gone to school there with her, and I think they let that go to their heads. But we don't know. When her daughter Maria was actually married in the White House, and may I pause here just a second? Please don't let me get you off track. But as I mentioned, White House weddings, it's interesting to mention that President Nixon's daughter, Tricia Nixon Cox, and her husband were married 50 years ago this year in the White House. And I am old enough to remember when that happened, and there's been some wonderful things. I would like to send you a clip of this when I discuss Pat Nixon, one of my favorite first ladies. But a White House wedding would have to be an absolutely marvelous, marvelous, wonderful thing. And Tricia is still as lovely and quiet and soft-spoken today as she was back when I was a little girl watching that on television. So it is the people's house in many ways, and I just wanted to mention that to you, and I will try to remember to send that clip. But in any case, let's go back to the Monroes. When their daughter Maria was married in the White House, which had now been refurbished and painted a lustrous white on the outside. No foreign dignitaries or government officials were invited. The guest list was closed and included only the very closest family members. And so I think that's very important to note. Mrs. Monroe spoke French fluently, and during her everyday conversations, she would break out into French and would treat you with contempt if you could not understand her. Dolly, and this is kind of sad, and I wonder if this is entirely true. It would be interesting to see if we could understand why. Dolly had organized support for a local orphanage, and we have all of our first ladies seem to adopt some interest to use their position to promote, and you are familiar with many of these. Mrs. Reagan probably had one of the most familiar in the 20th century, Just Say No to Drugs. Barbara Bush was literacy. Betty Ford was mental health awareness. I used to could name them all, but it is very interesting. But Dolly had supported an orphanage, and largely for orphans of war or different situations. Wasn't unusual to lose both parents to illness. So she had quite a enterprise going there for this orphanage. And the idea was that her successors as presidential wives would continue to undergird the orphanage. Mrs. Monroe would have nothing to do with it whatsoever. She wouldn't call on other DC wives. Now, you and I have a hard time relating to that. But let's look at a couple of things. First of all, that seemed to be sort of a responsibility of Washington wives, is to pay courtesy visits to everybody. I don't know if it's to get together, to hear the latest gossip, or what, but it was part of the formal expectations. Well, you would go over and see the wife of Senator so and so, or Justice so and so. You would go over, and his wife would come over and see you. If you weren't there, you would leave a little card with your name and the time that you came, and of course that's a reference to what we now call calling cards. And this generation doesn't have any idea what they are, but that was just part of your formal function. And you know that Dolly had to be the absolute best. She was energetic, tireless, friendly, never met a stranger. And Mrs. Monroe did none of that. She did not call on anybody. And she was extremely limited in who she would see, in whom she would see. She would have her daughters, if you wanted to see her, and there might be a slight chance that she would agree to see you. First of all, you would meet with her daughter Eliza, and Eliza, I think, was probably the main one, who was the filter, I guess is a good word for it, with her mother's guest list. And if Eliza felt that you were worthy to see Mom, then she would set up a subsequent appointment, and if not, she would dismiss you with no explanation. Thank you for bye, and it just added to the sense of, well, is that how we're going to be treated going there? Why all of this seeming snobbery? She also brought beautiful French furniture to the new White House. It was so elegantly decorated, and largely in the French furniture. I want to say, well, I'll be wrong. If you're listening, you can look this up to see. It would have probably been Louis XV furniture, but I could be wrong. So, but and she would not forgive me, especially since I'm not speaking in French. But she redecorated the White House using this very elegant and ornate, gilded, by gilded I mean gold paint, a lot of gold paint and trim, this kind of furniture and decor. And it was, considered at the height of beauty and elegance. And it just looked like, there's a wonderful painting that's out there of the Adams as the first occupants of the unfinished White House, of having a great rope strewn from one side of the room to the other, and they were hanging their wash up. So we've come a long way from that. Very different women. So is she snobby? All this Frenchness, her father being wealthy when she was a little girl, spending all this time in France, what in the world? I mean, I think probably Monroe is responsible for saving poor Thomas Paine from the guillotine over there too. He'd gone over there to help them with their revolution, found himself very quickly running afoul of it. So, the Monroes, they've been around the block when it comes to diplomatic circles and being in famous places around historical figures. Had all of this gone to her head? Well, I'm very pleased to tell you, in one sense of the word, no, it was not. Elizabeth was not a snob in this regard. Elizabeth most likely suffered from a severe form of epilepsy. You and I can tell you personally that my father had epilepsy and had seizures that could not be controlled entirely by medicine, and he had no way of telling really when one was coming until, just a minute or two before it would start, and it severely limited some of the things that he was able to do. So I want you to think about that. And we live in a day, and even Daddy did too, in a day where people were much more understanding. Back in this era, we're in the 19th century by now. In the 19th century, they still did not understand. They still did not understand epilepsy, and it was treated with suspicion and fear and what's wrong with you. And she would have been humiliated beyond description to have been in a social setting and with those kind of feelings, and then to have that have happened. So we'll see this again when we look at our dear Ida McKinley, wife of President um, William McKinley, and she had epilepsy too. And it was a little bit different then, because he is at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries, and you'll see a little bit of shift in opinion. But I think Elizabeth just could not face, and I don't blame her. Better to hide behind the veneer of snobbery than to admit to such a difficulty. Later in her life, she fell near or in a fireplace during a seizure and sustained terrible burns. And this was something very, very real that could happen to anyone having seizures like this. So let's look at Elizabeth this way. She was a woman of bravery and beauty and a strong character who could endure her husband's travels and responsibilities. She had had 3 children, 2 daughters living into adulthood, and a precious toddler son that she lost due to illness, I think before he was 2. But she was a mother who loved her children, loved her husband, and she dealt with this debilitating illness in the best way that she could. She brought to the White House, if not the hospitality and warmth and gentility of Dolly, she brought style and glamour and her own kind of patriotism and historical experience. Here was someone who was an American heroine before we even had a big concept of something like that. So, let's not throw her out as just someone to not be valued. I've got 2 things I want you to think about before I close today. First of all, let me say when we come back next time, we're going to talk about Louisa Adams, and I think that you will love her too. But let's say a couple of things about Elizabeth Monroe. First of all, her upkeep of the White House, her refurbishing of it, will help another First Lady who was also enamored of the French style. And you'll probably figure that out. I want you to think about that. After Elizabeth leaves the White House, some of her furniture is stored up in the attic. And when the subsequent First Lady, many years down the road, decides to do some major refurbishing in the White House, she goes into the attic and she finds these pieces precisely to her liking and appreciation. So I want you to think about that and see if you can figure out who that is. The other thing is this, and we'll talk about this particular point I'm about to make in more detail when we talk about the wife of Andrew Jackson, who never became First Lady. There is a terrible climate emerging in Washington, D.C. at the time of Mrs. Monroe, of what your author calls, Betty Crowley calls, cave dwellers. These are Washington socialites who are there for every administration, and it seems like their primary function is to come out of their caves and criticize and belittle high-ranking individuals, the First Lady in particular. It could be journalists, they could be socialites themselves, they could be people that are responsible in some way or the other, in some role of government or society. And to me, I just want to say, go back in your cave. I remember when George Walker Bush became president, he was much maligned by the cave dwellers because, yes, they're still there. He was much maligned by the cave dwellers because he and Laura actually went to bed at night and didn't go all around to these parties all night long socializing. And he was roundly criticized and made fun of for that. So think about this environment that is really starting to take shape. And these cave dwellers who are vicious and unkind and fickle, if they had gotten a hold of Mrs. Monroe and if they had known of her illness, it would have been unbearable for her. So I want you to remember Mrs. Monroe with a soft spot in your heart, and I don't want you to look at her as that French-speaking hoity-toity woman. I want you to think of her as an able wife who served her husband the best way that she could with those dramatic limitations. So I hope this has piqued your interest a little bit in Mrs. Monroe, and she'll be very pleased. The pictures I'm sending you, I will go back to being right in front of the camera myself, but I like these pictures of the First Ladies. So, and I want to send you another one to go along with this lecture. But once you watch the lecture, if you can figure out who I'm talking about in the question, who built their White House refurbishments on Mrs. Monroe's selections, you can figure that out. Let me know what you think. Well, this has been a great fun to talk with you about today, and I can't wait till we come back and we talk about Mrs. Louisa Adams, wife of John Quincy, who I don't think was the easiest person on the planet with whom to live. Listen, I wish you a good evening, and I hope that you're having some fun exploring these marvelous biographical um, glimpses that we're taking, and that you will build upon them through your own research and interest.